Welcome to the session on creating 360-degree panoramic images to look at creating virtual tours for cultural heritage. My name is Dr. Andy Holland. I'm a Research Fellow in Architectural Heritage, School of Civil Engineering, the University of Leeds. 360-degree photography, you've probably all come across it. They are spherical images created from a fixed point. If you imagine a sphere with the user at the center, then the viewer's viewpoint can be rotated 360 degrees of rotation around the vertical axis or the y-axis. We call that yaw. And they can also rotate through 360 degrees around a horizontal axis. We call that the x-axis or pitch. Multiple nearby 360s can be linked together to create a virtual tour. This provides a really strong experience for the user of actually being in the place that you're creating the virtual tour of. They're easier and cheaper than VR environments to implement, especially when using something like this VR headset in the bottom right corner. This is a very cheap way of doing things. This one I think cost me about $10 when I was in Jordan. And my phone slot's in the front of it. It uses the movement sensor inside the phone to work out when I'm moving my head and orientates the view, the yaw and the pitch appropriately based upon those movements. So they give a really good immersive environment. Because these images aren't that large, but they're not as strong in terms of bandwidth, they're not as heavy as VR environments, then they're much better suited to online presentation and are also being implemented on mobile phones, light devices like that. So the one you can see in the bottom left corner is a typical 360-degree photograph where multiple images have been combined together and then stretched into this 2:1 ratio photo, and we call this an equirectangular 360. And the left and right edges wrap round and match each other, and the same at the top and bottom. Although in our case, we've put our logo across the bottom to cover up where our tripod is from where this was captured. So there are two main methods of creating 360 photography. You can buy dedicated 360-degree cameras. These come as professional systems such as Google Street View, which are obviously very expensive, highly integrated, very quick to capture the 360 photographs. But there are also consumer level 360 cameras. The one on the left is the ReConHeritage S. We've got GoPro's offering in the middle and Garmin's on the right hand side, although there are many other offerings as well. One of the things about these is you'll see that they have a fisheye lens on both sides, and that's probably most clear from the ReConHeritage S side view of that. However, there is an inherent error in that obviously it can see 180 degree by 180 degrees on each side and tries to stitch those two together. And because there is a gap between those lenses where the camera body sits, there is inevitably going to be a slight error when it stitches them together. The smaller that gap, in other words, the thinner the device, then the less apparent that error is when it's stitched together. And with the Theta S, from more than about a meter or so away, it was difficult to tell that there was a stitching join in the two images. With the Garmin, for instance, there have been several reviews online saying that this is more apparent, more problematic. And therefore, if you create a 360, as you're scrolling around with your head, when you look at that gap, where that line of stitching is, you can sometimes see it. The other method of creating 360s are multi-photo composites. Again, there are multiple high-end systems that will do this using multiple cameras or integrated into a single capture device, such as, for instance, these in the bottom corner, Facebook's semi-modular system, which it released a few years ago, the X24 and the X6, for instance. There are DIY multi-camera systems you can build yourself, such as this one I built for a previous project, and I built this using a 3D printer and 6 GoPros. This one, it worked okay. It had some problems. Part of the problem was I built it out of 3D printed it out of plastic. In the heat of summer in Jordan, the plastic had a tendency to soften and move, and that caused me problems with aligning the photos, but it worked generally. But probably the easiest way, if you're not going to go down a dedicated high-end camera system, is to use a camera and to take multiple row panoramas. So use the same camera to take multiple photos. And this, on the right hand side here, you see my camera on my multi-row panoramic head on my tripod, being used by one of our volunteers on Case in Jordan on the other project I work on. So the dedicated 360 cameras have great advantages in that they take an instant photo. You press the button and the photo is done. Most of the stitching is done in the camera, and you get a very good photo. It's not particularly high resolution, so you can't zoom in, for instance, on any of the carving underneath the seats in this theatre, Roman theatre in Amman. But it's very quick to deploy, and if you're wanting to show tours and you're not wanting to have really high detail of elements on the walls or carvings or inscriptions, etc., then this would work very well. One of the problems with it is that you have to trigger the camera remotely for the best results. Otherwise, you end up with the person pressing the button in the shot, or at least their head. As you can see, this is my friend taking the photo, and unfortunately, he's also in the photo. However, most of these cameras work on Wi-Fi and will allow you to connect to them with your phone and have apps to trigger them, and you can hide around one of the corners or inside out of sight, trigger the camera from there and be able to get a photo with nobody in it. But you also need a tripod. No matter which method of photography you're going to use in order to collect the raw data for your 360 images, you still need to think about how to get the best images possible. Think about initially your scene that you're trying to capture and that you're building your 360 tour in. So for every 360, think about, when is this area quietest? Does it have a natural pattern during the day with lots of people on foot, lots of cars and other noise going on that you want to avoid? If it's a site or a location that has a lot of visitors, when do those visitors arrive and leave? And therefore, when's the best time to avoid, and when's it going to be quietest? And the same is true of visitors to an archaeological site. For each location that you're taking photos of, have a think about having a quick tidy up of any rubbish that's around on the floor and in the scene that you're about to photograph prior to taking your photographs. Your scene will look better, and your tour will be less distracting with rubbish on it. And no curator of a site is going to object to you picking up rubbish. Plan your locations for your photographs for your virtual tour quite carefully. Think about what you need in order to build a full tour, and then work systematically through those photographs. And for every location, make sure you're taking notes and sketches, drawing little maps of where you are, because the GPS built into your camera or your phone is not accurate, and you best see that when you take multiple photographs at the same point, and when you plot them and you have a look at them on the computer, the locations the GPS says each photograph in is not always the same for each photo. They wander about by several meters, and that's because there's an error in your GPS, and that's inevitable. So extra notes and photographs of where you are and sketches can really help, because you're going to need to locate each of these 360s in your tour in the sequence in the right place. If you're indoors, that becomes even more problematic. And one of the things I always look for is a tourist map, site map, or a free guide. If there's one of those available, even if it's in a language I can't read, I grab hold of it and I use the maps on there to draw and mark where my locations are. It saves you having to try and sketch a whole site, but if you can't get one, then yes, making a map, a quick sketch map, is invaluable later on when you're processing the data. The same thing with information boards. If there are site tourist information boards or visitor boards that point out points of interest, I take a quick photo of them with my phone. It's really useful to be able to go back and remind yourself exactly where that particular point of interest was, or the information about it that's been presented by the site. That's been presented by the site staff. Finally, take more photos than you think you need. It's better to take more photos in each 360 than just the right amount. Inevitably, there will always be an odd blurred photograph, or one where the camera moves slightly, or something in the background moves slightly. In the images on the right hand side, the goats were a particular challenge on this site. And I took more photos so that when they moved, they were out of my shot. Before you go to the site, again, think about camera setup. Make sure your camera's clean, it's got plenty of memory, the batteries are all charged, and especially clean the lens, because you don't want any dirt on the lens. Think about the time of day you're going to be taking the photos. Not only just how quiet the scene is, as we talked about a moment ago, but also the light. So in the middle of the day, the sunlight is directly overhead, shadows are straight down and are eliminated to some degree, but that doesn't last long. Early in the morning and late in the evening, just after sunrise and just before sunset, the shadows are very long, and that can be intrusive into your photos. In the one on the image on the right hand side, Jerash, the shadows of the columns were cast across the road I'm walking on and I'm about to photograph, but that didn't matter because that was fairly easy to explain in the scene, and it didn't detract from the image I was taking. And lastly, if you can possibly do so, check your imagery before you leave the site. I often have a laptop in my bag with me, which allows me to download the photos just before I leave the site. This has two benefits. Firstly, if the camera got too hot and stopped recording, which is quite common with digital cameras in very warm environments, then I know I've got to go back and redo my imagery. And secondly, I download the photos from the memory cards in the cameras to my laptop, or at least copy them across, and then I have two copies of all the images, one on the SD cards of the cameras and one on the laptop. And then I have a backup if something fails. If you're using a camera rather than a mobile phone, you need to set it at one zoom setting. You don't want any zoom variation in your images within a single 360. If you're using a camera where you can change the lens, such as a DSLR, then use a fixed or a prime, what we call a prime lens. There's one without any zoom. They also tend to have the least amount of distortion in them, and so are good for this. You need to set your camera or your phone to the lowest ISO you think is reasonable. So these are the same general comments that we talked about in photogrammetry. These are rules for good photography, and good photography will give you good 360 photographs. So ISO between 100 and 400 gives you nice sharp images with low noise, without too much grain, which could otherwise get in the way. Again, the aperture, just like the photogrammetry, you want it to be a good depth of field, so you've got plenty of the plenty of the view in focus. So something above f8 is always good. Not too small an aperture, or nothing above f16 or f18, because at that point the images start to get unsharp. Phone cameras, on most phones, the camera has a fixed aperture, so you don't have a choice to set this. White balance. We want to set the white balance to a particular one setting and not have it on automatic, for exactly the same reason. You don't want variation in the color of the light that your camera is recording as it adjusts the white balance for each image when it's faced towards the sun and away from the sun. So you want to take it off auto and leave it on a fixed setting. If you have a tripod, use it if you can. If you're only doing this on a phone camera, then it's possible to use a tripod for the camera. So for instance, this is on the right hand side, this is my very cheap $5 camera mount for my phone, and you'll see that I've padded it out with a bit of sponge to make sure that the rotation point of the tripod rotates around, which is this attachment point here down at the bottom, is in line with the camera itself. So this camera sits exactly over that rotation point. Without the sponge, it sits slightly forward, and we'll talk about why that's important when we get to errors. But remember that when we get on later on into the presentation. The tripod's great because it avoids shake and blur, but more importantly, it means that the camera is rotating around the same point, and that's really important to reduce any errors, and so that all these multiple photos will stitch together into a single 360 well. And you want to take photos with lots of overlap, at least 30% on each side, in other words, 60% on all images. The wider your lens in terms of the field of view, then the fewer the number of images you will need. But wide-angle lenses often have more distortion at the edges, and again, you want to avoid too much distortion. Usually there's a sort of a balance between having enough images to cover the full 360-degree globe and reducing the amount of distortion. Some of the common problems that can occur with 360 photographs, if you're taking multiple photographs and merging them together into a single 360, then movement of people, objects, or in this case animals, is a problem. Now, this is an extreme example where somebody has taken a panorama and the cat happens to have walked along the panorama at the same time. You end up with this enormously long multi-legged cat, which is funny as an image, but not particularly good if you're trying to present a site. Other problems we get are distortion and exposure. The bottom image, these are two images that are being used to make up a panorama, and these two frames, you can see they're taken next to each other. The camera's been rotated very slightly, so there's lots of overlap. The overlap is all of this section here is overlapping, which is good, but because this is around dusk or sunset, the light levels are changing very rapidly at this point. So in the time it's taken to smooth the camera, rotate the camera around one position and take the next photograph, then the light levels from this one to this one have got much darker, and that is clear in the photo. When blended together, if you imagine enough photographs to make a 360, the first photo is going to be much lighter than the last photos, and that's a problem. You can get away with a little bit of manual adjustment and matching, but too much, and it's difficult to get to make it seamless. The image at the top has a similar problem in that you can see each of these photos has got a different exposure level and therefore a different color of blue, and it's very obvious where the edges are. The other thing this photo suffers from is distortion, and the person who's taken this has used a wide lens and hasn't used enough overlap and enough images, and so they're using too much of the far edges of each image, and that's resulted in this distortion here. If you've ever tried to take panoramic photos, then the one error you probably came across a lot is these sort of lines that don't match up in multiple when you composite your image together. And those are down to something called parallax error. And this is the major problem in creating these 360 images. So in this equirectangular 360, you can see it here on the floor, on the floor tiles. You can see it on edges of parts of the building. There's more up in the roof structure if you look closely. And you've seen this image before. So left and right, so two images taken from very slightly different positions give you different views of the same subject. We talked about this in photogrammetry, in the photogrammetry session, about how that is useful for photogrammetry. For 360 photographs, it's a problem. And this is because in the camera, there is a point at which the light rays overlap. We called that the perspective center in photogrammetry. So we're talking about the same point, although it's in 360, it's referred to the no parallax point, because if you rotate your camera around that point, the perspective center, or this overlap, this crossover point here, then parallax is eliminated. And no parallax point does vary with both zoom and also a little bit with focus, though less so. Because most cameras rotate around the tripod mount screw point on the body, then they're not rotating around the parallax point. So here down in this example, we've got a camera. We're imagining that it's attached to a tripod on its tripod mount point, and therefore is rotating around a point in the center of the body. And the parallax point is this blue dot in the middle of the lens. And as you can see, the parallax point moves. It's not rotating around the parallax point. And this is how you get those parallax errors with those lines not matching up perfectly. And in 360 photographs, obviously, it creates those errors, but it also means that the alignment and stitching together is difficult. And if you're using automated software, it's less likely to work. So that's not good. So the way to get it to work is to rotate your camera around the no parallax point. So in this example, we have a tripod which has a little extension bar and allows us to rotate around a point we set. We've set it for this point here, this blue dot. And that means that you see the body moves, but the camera is rotating around the parallax point. And in this case, there wouldn't be any parallax error. Images would stitch really nicely together with very little distortion. To do this with a large camera, you need a multi-row panoramic head, and that looks like one of it. This is mine, again, on case being recorded. And you can see we've got a rotating base, which rotates around a set number of degrees that I tell it. It moves this arm. Can be moved back and forth so that the camera body is pointing exactly at the center of the rotation. And then the camera can be moved along this arm in order to get it so that the point of rotation is also in exactly the right place on the lens. And this means that these photographs taken with these on this camera have no parallax and stitched together very well. For a camera phone, or for a phone on the camera, that's a little bit more difficult to do. You can do it handheld if you're careful and you think about it. But you could also make multi-row panorama head very easily. This is an L-shaped piece of, in this case, it's plexiglass, but you can do it out of wood or anything really. It's held so that it has a little indent so the camera can sit in it. It's held with some what look like elastic, or to be honest, it could be hair elastics, I suspect. It has multiple camera points to allow it to make sure that you can attach it to the tripod at the right point, so that that's exactly down the center of the camera if that's where the camera lens is. And it's got multiple attachment points here for a pivot so that you can get the pivot exactly in line with the camera this way. And then when you take your photographs and you move this around, you'd be rotating exactly around the no parallel point on the camera. It's very simple to make, very easy to do. However, you can get away with handheld if you're really careful. And we'll talk about how you do that in a moment. So if you're taking photos, what do you do with them? A variety of pieces of software. The first one we're going to talk about is a free piece called Google Street View app. I'm sure you've all come across Google Street View. However, there is an app that you can also get for your phone that allows you to capture the 360 images that are used in Google Street View. Most of the actual capture of the images and the creation of the 360 is done on the phone at the same time, so you don't have to do very much processing. Hooking Panorama Photo Stitcher is a free piece of software if you have multiple photographs in multi-row panoramas and you want to stitch them together. It works quite well. I've used it before. It is free, and the better your photos in terms of rotating around the no parallax point, having good depth of field, no difference in the white balance, etc., makes this software work perfectly adequately. You'll get good panoramas, 360s out of it. Microsoft Image Composite Editor, I've never really got very good results out of, but other people have. And again, that's free. Alternatively, there are some paid softwares. If you have Photoshop has some built-in ability to do this, to stitch together panoramas. There are tutorials on YouTube that are probably better to watch for that. PT GUI is a really good piece of software, or it's about $100 odd, but builds tours really well. The one I've used a lot is called Color Auto Pano Giga. Unfortunately, GoPro bought it, and because GoPro make a camera that takes instant 360s, they got rid of the software. They bought it in order to kill the software off. So you can't buy it anymore, which is really frustrating. However, there are still a few copies kicking about the internet. So if you can find a copy, it's really good. There's a lot of parts of the process that it automates and is really great for. Of presenting the 360s, once you've created them, then if you're using a desktop computer, you're going to need a way of viewing the software, viewing 360s. And the software I use is FSP Viewer. It's free. You can download it. I believe it works on Macs as well as desktop PCs. So I recommend using that, although there are other options as well. For online, if you're creating online viewers, then we're going to talk about Google Virtual Tour, and then I'm going to talk very briefly about Penellum. And these two allow you to create online tours and to put 360s onto websites. So the Google Street View app, it's available for Android and Apple phones. Download it from the Play Store or the Apple Store. It's very, very easy to use. You use it for adding 360 content, 360 images to Street View on Google Maps and Google Earth. But because it helps you create those, you don't have to upload your images to Google Earth or Google Maps straight away. It also saves them on your phone. It provides on-screen instructions and guidance as you're making them. However, to get really good results, you have to think a little bit more about the photography. Because it's so intuitive to use and it takes you through the process, if you don't think about the photography itself, you end up with bad results. So the no parallax point is still really important. This image on the right-hand side is from one of the tutorials, and the woman doing the tutorial pans around and showing her completed 360, and you have this pillar on a dock that is clearly quite a bad stitch. Now, to be fair to her, she's stood very close to this, and therefore it's always going to be difficult to get good results. This is because she's not rotating around the parallax point. The most common reason for this is when you hold a phone and you want to take a panorama, most people rotate around their own center of mass. and they move the camera in front of them like this. Now, obviously, the parallax point is in the lens of the camera, so you're not rotating around the no parallax point here. In order to get good results, you have a think about rotating yourself around the camera and the camera staying in a fixed position. And that way you end up with rotating the camera lens around the no parallax point rather than and reducing the amount of errors that you're likely to get. So how do you use this? Well, go into the street. Once you've downloaded and installed Google Street View app on your phone, you go in and open the app. And any 360s you take are initially private. So they're in this private tab up here until you publish them. So you click on the orange camera icon down in the bottom right corner. This takes you to a little pop-up that reminds you that your photos are going to be stored on your device, on your camera, and tells you where. Now, because the image is going to be saved to your camera's memory, it's useful to know where, because they don't go in the usual gallery where usually your phone records photos. So make a note of this information. It'll be different for your camera, but make a note of where your camera is storing them. You should note that this first bit on Android, for instance, this 0 usually just means the camera's internal memory. If it's a 1, it's usually your micro SD card that you've got in your camera. So really you only need the 0 or the 1 and to know what that means. But this bit afterwards, pictures / panoramas in my case, or it might be different for yours, that's the one you need to know. And make a note of it for later. So once you've done that, it takes you to this page. Now here you can capture 360 photographs by taking a photosphere down at the bottom. You can also upload previously captured 360s if you've got them from another device or from another phone. That's here. And if you have one of those dedicated 360 cameras, you can link it here as well, although you probably also have dedicated software, a dedicated app that goes with that camera. But to capture a new 360 using your phone, click on the Take Photosphere button down here at the bottom. And that takes you to the camera capturing, photo capturing point. And it shows you a preview of what your camera is seeing. Now, it's not the whole of what your camera sees because it's cutting off the edges where there's a lot more distortion. It's only looking at the center portion. And you follow the instructions and you move the camera so that this white circle is over the orange dot. And when you get the white circle over the orange dot, it takes a photo. And you can see the progress of this little orange bar around the tick button. You then pan your camera around, preferably rotating around the no parallax point until you see the next orange dot. And it will then add that photo to the screen. And you keep moving around until you've done this, covering the whole sphere. As you do it, it's putting the result of the image on the screen, as you can see here. And so you'll start to see whether you've got gaps. They're not perfectly aligned at this point, but don't worry about that. If you've rotated around the no parallax point, they should align relatively well. Once you've captured all the images in your 360, then you press the tick button. Remember, you need to look up and look down and do multiple rows in order to cover the whole of the sphere. Once you press the tick button, the app will now start to align and process the images. And the little Street View orange man here will be shown sort of moving around this little white square and rectangle until that process is finished. And once the process is finished, the little man runs off the screen, runs away, which is kind of cute, but just one of those odd little details that Google put in. Once it's done that, it's the image is now in your phone's memory, wherever it said it will record them. If you now want to edit that image, you can close the app, go to that location, edit that image, or download it to a computer and edit it if you want to put logos in, for instance. And then if you save it back to that location, this app, if you're wanting to upload it to Google Street View, this app won't know that you've changed the image. It will just load it back up as if it from the location it saved it. But you can see I've got another app down here of my rather scruffy living room, just a test one. And they appear here in your private area. If you want to publish one, you click on it, I'll open it up. You click on the image to open it, as I say, and then now you can check the image location. So if you've if you've recorded this indoors, you particularly want to check the location, as I said, because the GPS isn't very accurate. And even outdoors, I would suggest you do. And to do that, you click on the 3 dots, you click Edit Location, then Google Maps will open with a dot with a number in it of the location of that image. You can do multiple images at once, hence the image 1. And it opens. You can drag that dot around with your finger to wherever you think it needs to be, and correct the location. All the usual Google Map functions with 2 fingers spreading apart in order to zoom in, etc. work just as usual. Once you've got the dot in the place where you're happy with it, click the tick in the top corner, and that will update the location of the image. And you can now press the upload button to publish it to Google Maps and Street View. Doing it, so that's this button down here. Doing that will make it visible to the public. That's how you capture using the Google Street View app. Very quick, very easy to do. Have a think. As long as you think about how you capture the photographs, should be easy enough. What do you do with these images? I've not talked about other softwares on how you composite multiple row panoramas together from a camera on things like using Color or Huggin or one of the other softwares, because each of those is different, and there are plenty of tutorials online to look at those, depending on which software you pick. But ultimately, all of them create an equirectangular image that's the 360 that you can use either to view on your desktop with the software I suggested earlier, and you can create a virtual tour and upload them to the web. The easiest way to make a virtual tour is probably Google Tour Creator. So you go to this link. So this is Google Tour Creator. Click Get Started, and it takes you into using your Google account. If you don't have a Google account, you need to create a Gmail account. It's very quick and easy. Okay. So to create a tour, it's nice and simple. Click New Tour. You give it a name. So you need a cover photo. You select an image. Give you a cover image. This is one that I took on the case, so in Jordan, and I'm going to use Jordan as my example because I've got plenty of it. You need to pick a category, pick history, but there are culture and humanities in there as well, history, travel and leisure, depending on what your tour's about. Just pick history, press create. To start off with, you need to locate your first scene. Now you can do that using the Google map here, and annoyingly it always loads the map up on San Jose in America, where Google's based, or nearby anyway. So you can navigate to where you need. In my case, I'm looking at on case in Jordan. So in my case, I'm looking at the Jordan Museum. So I drop him there, and that's about where I am. Now I can zoom around, and actually that's located almost exactly where I want to be, but I can now use the usual Street View tools to get it just in the right place, and that's where I want to do. So that's my first scene, and I click Add Scene. That's put me in the right place, but that's not the view I want people to see as the first view. I want them to see the entrance to the museum rather than off to one side. So I can click Set Starting View in the bottom corner, rotate it to where I want it to start, and press Save. I can give the scene a name, give it a location. I can credit the image, in this case, Google Street View. I can also add some ambient noise. So I could record an MP3 and upload it here and add some ambient background noise. So if this was, for instance, I was looking at a waterfall or a fountain in the center of a courtyard, then I could add a recording of some water bubbling away in the background to give you a sense of the background noise. I can also add a scene narration. So I could narrate a little piece of recording. I could record that as an MP3. Maybe I want to talk about a particular feature. You can add that there into that so that when the person arrives in this point in the tour, they get that narration. I can also add points of interest. So by clicking on Add Point of Interest, get this little blue information box, drag it around, put it onto this here. Actually, put it on here, look. And that point of information can have, we can give it a title. So the basalt coffin. And I could then put up to 300 characters of text description in there if I wanted. I can now overlay another larger image. And again, I can record a narration so that when the user clicks on that, they get my voice telling them about this particular object. And you can add multiple points of interest in any scene. So this one is a Corinthian capital from a column, and I could describe it in there. So that's the first scene. And now you add more scenes in exactly the same manner. If you don't have, and you can see here we're back at, annoyingly, in America. So you can also search for your location. You go to One Case in Jordan. That makes it quicker to find. So our first scene was out there by the door. I'm going to move us in a bit. And our second scene is going to be here. Now these are using Google Street View images. If there isn't a Google Street View image here, or it isn't the one you want, or the image you've got has got lots of clutter in it, like this one, it's got this board that was not finished and has been moved now, and there are other items in this scene that maybe I don't want, or it's got a lot of blur and it's not very good, then you can use your own. And to do that, you upload an image. You select your 360 and you upload them. We're going to do that in a moment. But for the moment, I'm just going to add this as a second scene. Add scene. And again, I'm going to set the starting point as, so that's where our previous one, facing this way. So I'm going to make this one face in the same direction so that when you transition from one scene to the other, it's obvious. Add another scene, but instead of right, let's get to about there. So instead of them in here, we want to go over this way a bit. So you can build up multiple scenes just by adding them in. You keep adding them in until you've got everything you need. This is nice and simple, but one of the problems with this system is it's very linear. It forces you to, forces your users to follow the sequence of scenes that you want them to have and the experience that you want them to take them around, and doesn't allow them much freedom to move around themselves. that can be useful if you've only got a limited amount of information, or you want to give them a particular set of information, tell one particular story, and don't want them to get sidetracked on lots of other detail. But equally, it can also be problematic. So we've added a sequence of scenes along here. So this is all street view imagery. However, inside this building here is a gallery of sculpture. Now, when Google came and recorded it, it was closed, but I have 360 photos from inside there that I recorded using the methods we talked about earlier. So I want to upload one of those, and it happens to be this one. Open, add scene, and that through that door is the door we were just looking at. So I've added it in, so I can add scenes of images I've got myself rather than the street view ones. And again, we can add points of interest. So this one, for instance, this sculpture is Maenad, which is one of the Greek mythology, is one of the accompaniers of the Greek god Dionysus, and I could have a close-up detailed image of, if I had it, of that. I could add site narration. I can add another scene down here. I've got multiples in this gallery scene, and it's so the Maenad's back down there. Now we've got this one. And you'll notice I made a bit of a mistake here. I left my bag in shot. So when I was taking the images that have been composited together to create this image, but one of the things I forgot to do is to hide my bag far enough around the back of this pillar in order to not be seen. But there we are. We make mistakes sometimes. So we can add more points of interest. For instance, here, we'll bring it around, put it on this sculpture here, which is a satyr, and we give it a title. And I can also add in more description here, up to about 300 characters. One of the problems with using 300 characters is it doesn't have very much room, so I can always record a narration and add it in, and that allows me to go into a bit more detail. Although you don't want to go too much, otherwise your visitors to your site will get bored and they'll browse away. So if we now want to publish on the web, now we press the publish button. And when you press the publish button, you can choose either public or unlisted. Public, obviously everybody can see it, but unlisted means only people who've got the link can see the tour. We can use unlisted for this. It's good for draft versions and testing things before you go fully live. And when you press publish, you get this link, which you can copy by pressing this button here, which we're going to do. And you can also go to the tour. If you press view tour, it takes you to Google Poly, which is just the Google's tour viewer. And here you can see our tour. So there's our starting point outside the Case Museum, the first scene we chose with the correct view. We've got our points of interest, which if we click on gives us information. Remember, we only put titles into these, but normally you'd have descriptions and much more detail, and possibly sound files as well. If we choose the next scene, you can see it takes us on into the next scene. We can scroll around and move on to onto the next scene. And you'll notice that as we do this, the feature of this is that it's very linear. You can direct your viewers or your users the way you want them to. you can direct the users the way you want them to see the scenes. And that can be quite a good for structured views where you want them to take a particular structured story through an image. Here we're in the gallery. You can see, click on the Maniad. So this is how you create a Google tour. Right. To use this, if we want to use this in a website, for instance, then we can click on this share link. Click on there and click embed. Then we get this iframe code. Now this iframe code lets us put our tour on any website that we want. You need to copy that code and make a note of it. Put it into a notepad or Word, but save it for later. And this is going to allow us to look at or put it in a website. So Google Tour Creator is online tour creation using Street View imagery and your own 360s. You can upload 360s for your tour either as part of the Street View app creation or whilst you're creating the tour in Google Tour Creator. You can add points of interest with additional images, narration, background sound. The complete tour can then be embedded directly into a website using that iframe code. And that's really good for closely linked scenes. Obviously, if there's no current Google Street View imagery, you're going to need to make sure you've got enough coverage with your 360s to allow you to do a full tour. So how do you get your tour on your website? You follow the Google Poly link, as we said. You click on share, and you copy that embed code like we showed a moment ago. And that's an iframe, which is a website programming element or HTML element, and it can be pasted into most web pages. Most web providers, such as Wix, WordPress, Squarespace, Doodle, any of these, will allow iframes in their on their platforms, and you can also use that iframe information to embed a Google Tour inside an ArcGIS story map, just as we showed you in the previous tutorial. So this is a Wix web page, just a blank web page I've created on one of my websites to show you how you embed a Google Tour. We've given it a name of Google Virtual Tour example. We go to Add, More, and pick HTML iframe. Drag that to be the size we want it to be. To fill the page. And then we click on the edit code. We paste in the iframe embed code that we got from Google Poly a minute ago, and we saved. So just paste that in there, and we press apply, and the Google Tour appears on your web page. It's all integrated. So if we preview this page, we go, there is the tour, and you can see all of our points of interest. You'd be able to hear our sounds if we put one in. We can work our way through the scenes, into the gallery. And that allows us to embed the Google Tour, as I say, into a web page, but you could also use the same process to embed a tour into ArcGIS story maps. So you can upload it to websites, you can upload it to ArcGIS story maps and embed them in those. The other thing you can do is, if you have a tour, when you're on Poly, this is back on Poly, Google Poly, then you can also share to social media. So that's Google Tour Creator. Finally, a quick word about Penellum. Not going to go into detail about Penellum. Penellum is another online way of presenting 360 imagery. It doesn't use the online 360 imagery like Google Street Map. This is used primarily for your own created content, so your own 360s. It's really good for inside buildings, for instance, where the tour is harder to navigate. Then this is an example tour. All of the tools needed and the information, the code needed in order to make a panorama view properly are embedded in the scripts they give and they provide as examples. But again, you can add information in as points in the image, but you can also include links, and that's the advantage over Google Tours. So I can go to, in this image, I could go off to the gallery, or I could have more. If I had a link here to this doorway at the back, I could click on that and it would take me. So you can have multiple links. It's a lot more free flowing, and a lot less linear than Google's method. So the library, and you can work your way around. So this is just a 2-point example. And you can embed those into your own website. Again, it's an iframe, that iframe and some code. That code's a lot more. There's a lot more of that code, but again, you're just copying it from Penellam's examples and making a few small changes. There's some really good tutorials on Penellam that will take you through it. So here I've created a short tour of Case using some of the 360s I created there, and then I've embedded it onto a page just like I did with the Google Virtual Tour example. Click on it to load, and what it gives you is a little point in the middle that shows you where you're pointing at. You can have multiple links. So on this one, where it stood on a Roman street, we've got some information about each of the buildings around us, but we've also got multiple links. So we've got information about these steps, but I've got a 360 there. I can go to that one, or I could also go to that one down there. You go to that one down there on the junction of two streets. So I've come from up there, it takes me back. I can go up onto that terrace up there. There's another 360 up there, or I can go down to here. And so there's multiple options about, and I can set those. It's a lot freer, so I can choose where I wander virtually in the site, rather than being constrained by a very linear feature like Google Tours. And that means that I feel more free, and I'm discovering and exploring for myself and finding the information out. But it also means you have to have enough images and have covered the ground well enough to make sure that people feel like they can go anywhere. It's frustrating if you don't have another 360, perhaps here in the middle of this courtyard area, because the user's going to want to go over there. In this case, I do have another one, but I haven't included it in this tour because this is just a quick demonstration. It allows you to move around, but it works very well, particularly good, as I say, for inside complex buildings where Google Tours is less. It's easy to follow around. The user is much more intuitive to the user to understand where they are and where they're moving to, whereas Google Tours, they just jump from one scene to another. And unless those themes are very close together, they can be a bit disorientating. Having said that, the Penellam system does use a bit more JavaScript and some other code to work your way through. You don't need to be very fluent in programming computer code because the examples will take you through. You need to host your images somewhere. An ImageGo is the one that's suggested. It needs something called cross-origin resource sharing. You don't really need to know about. You just need to check that whether you save your images and you host them online, it supports that, of course. But if you don't want to try and find out, or you can't find out, just using a free ImageGo account, and that works. And the scripts for Penellam are all on their website. Go to the documentation, go to example, and you can see here are the scripts. And there are examples and tutorials on how to use this, how to use their online how to use their scripts and how to adapt them, put in your own information. So this one here runs what's running this one top. What we've used already, most of those information ones, and you define the only bit you really need to change is this is the image location from ImageGo, so you put the location in there so it loads the right image, and you then need to tell it where the hotspots are in terms of pitch and yaw. And there's a debug tool that allows you to find that out.
Follow the tutorials, and if you haven't got a lot of code experience, then probably stick with the Google Tour Creator. But if you've done some experimentation with websites and you've coded a little bit, then it's well worth having a go with Penellum. It gives more options. The process to get out your web page online using Penellum is very similar to all the other examples we've used. You create a web page, you upload your images to a hosting site like ImageGo, create a blank time page, add the example code from Penellum as an iframe, then have a think about which images link to each other, use the debug tool to get everything to work right with pitch and yaw values correct, using the examples from Penellum, and then test it. Finally, we've got some links to some useful videos at the end here. The first one's on eliminating parallax. We've got two more on how to use Google Street View app on your phone to create 360s. And then finally, a quick YouTube video that takes you through using Google Virtual Tour Creator in a similar way to the one that we've already done in the presentation. So that's the end of the session. I hope it's been useful to you. We'll now go over on the conference call to any questions anybody has.